Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva and I've been doing live streams and podcasts on various Christian topics. Today's topic is the Christian Assembly. It's an 8-part series and this is part 8, the last episode of the series. So let's go ahead and get started. The title of today's broadcast, if you will, the title of today is The Pros and Cons of Small House Church Assemblies. So we've been talking about church and church assemblies, the history of church, and the number of people in church, and the type of churches that people worshiped in throughout the centuries. And it's been quite the series, I think. I've enjoyed it personally. Now, just a quick review. The first Christian assemblies met in small numbers in the members' houses, and they ate a meal together that featured a loaf and a cup of wine. That is, or was, a symbolic remembrance of the Last Supper of Christ. And this is how it was from after Jesus all the way up until the beginning of the 4th century. Now, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we saw that the supper that these assemblies had turned into more of a religious ritual, and ultimately the supper was done away with altogether, and you were left with the loaf and the cup of wine, and with the participants believing that the actual flesh and blood enter the Eucharist upon its blessing, and that indeed Christ was sacrificing himself again at each instance. Now, we also saw in some early Christian writers, which are also called the Ante-Nicene Fathers, that they started to call the table upon which the Eucharist was prayed over, they started to call that table the altar. And then they started calling the person who was doing the blessing a priest. And later, this was called the real presence, the idea that the actual flesh and blood of Jesus appears in the Eucharist. That term didn't come around until the 9th century. Now, in the early 4th century, a lot of big changes happened, and that started with the conversion of Constantine and his wife, and the legalization of Christianity and the availability of money and political power to the church. What we saw was large, lavish, temple-like buildings that were considered sacred were constructed, and those buildings had altars, images, and ornately garbed priests who performed the services which culminated in the communion or the Eucharist. Temple-like services and large buildings with altars and priests continue to the present time. But during the Reformation, that's the 16th century, then there was more big changes. And during the Reformation, things like sacred buildings, elaborate rituals, opulent worship were rejected. And reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin argued that the elevated status of priests, bishops, and ultimately the Pope could only and had only led to moral failure and abuses like the practice of indulgences. They said that money instead should go to the poor and that power should return to God. They also rejected icons or images in the churches. They rejected relics, decorative elements, and sacred architecture of churches. And so their church buildings were stripped of all those things. Nearly all the reformers, though, saw value in dedicated church buildings with large assemblies where the church could assemble. There's really only one exception that I could find to this, and that was the denomination referred to the Anabaptists. They believed that worship should be simple, community-based, and participatory. Groups like the early Puritans in the U.S., a group called the Separatists, English Baptists, and some Quaker movements also adopted this Anabaptist model through the 16th and 18th centuries. Now, at the present time, there are many underground house churches in places like China and Iran and primarily Muslim-dominated countries, and that is because of persecution. I was interested to find that there are a dozen or so listed house church movements that are done so by choice, not because of persecution or anything like that. And they actually claim to have numbers of over 100 million people, which that would be a lot of people. But understandably, it is difficult to count people when they're all meeting in houses. But nevertheless, if they say there's 100 million, there's got to be a good number of them, right? I found that the largest number of these comes from India, where they claim to have 80 million house church worshipers. And they come from primarily two different house church movements. One is called the Hindu Church of Christ, which may sound like a contradiction, but apparently it's Hindu from a cultural and social standpoint, but Christian in their beliefs, their spiritual beliefs. And then there's something called the Christukula Ashram Church, which forms small Christian communities and basic ecclesial communities, BECs, SCCs and BECs, they say. First, I want to talk about house churches and the Bible. Now, I would say that there's little doubt, certainly in my own mind, but also amongst theologians, that the first century Christians met in houses of members for what we would call in modern times church. And that continued until late 3rd century when some buildings were built, but really continued until the early 4th century, with Constantine. Now, you can find all kinds of verses in the New Testament that refer to house churches. And you can find a lot of verses that refer to house and or people in a house gathered, and it's kind of hard to tell whether they were there just because they gathered there at a house to pray, for instance, like when Peter was released from prison. Were they there just because they were decided to meet together at somebody's house to pray, or were they there because that was the house in which their church met? But there are definitely some verses that for sure mention that the people met in houses. So one example of that is Acts chapter 2, verse 46. It says, "Every day they continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts." This does show that they met at the temple, but that was not a change from their prior Jewish way of life. The Jewish people, the friends, those people who are friends in the Jewish community would meet together in groups at the temple to start their day off. There was also a midday prayer session, and there was also a late afternoon sacrifice. And people would meet, depending on their schedules, at the temple with their friends. So that was, I guess you'd say, just normal behavior. They continued to meet at the temple courts. But this idea of breaking bread, that definitely didn't just mean they had a meal. Whereas it might mean that nowadays you might say, hey, let's break bread sometime. This almost certainly meant that they were meeting in houses to celebrate the Last Supper or communion. Let's see, here's another one in Acts chapter 8, verse 3. "But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house." Now, I used to think that meant that he went from house to house, demanding that anybody who was in there who was a Christian come out. And so he went to all of the houses in Damascus and found whatever houses the Christians were hiding in. But that would have been impossible. It wouldn't have worked. There were too many houses. People would have heard him coming and so forth. So what it seems like what really happened was he was able to gain knowledge of which houses Christian assemblies were meeting in. And he went to those houses specifically, targeted those specific houses when there was an assembly going on. And that is where he went and dragged people out. Let's see. There's also Romans chapter 16, verses 3 through 5. It says, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ Jesus. Greet also the church that meets in their house," or at their house. 1 Corinthians 16:19. The churches in the province of Asia send you greetings. Priscilla and Aquila greet you warmly in the Lord, and so does the church that meets at their house. Colossians 4:15, give my greetings to the brothers and sisters at Laodicea, and to Nympha, and to the church that meets at her house. And Philemon chapter 1 verse 2, also to Apphia, our sister, and Archippus, our fellow soldier, and to the church that meets in your home. I have said this before, and will continue to reiterate it. I believe that we have the freedom in Christ to worship how we believe is the right way, the best way. I don't believe that, I'm not trying to find these verses that talk about meeting in houses to say that there it is right there, there's the example in the Bible. You have to meet in houses and nowhere else. What I've done in this series, and especially in today's episode, I wanted to look at the new covenant and see how meeting in houses as a Christian assembly could be a better medium for building our personal relationship with God and His Spirit that indwells inside of us. Now, one thing I found, and I'm sure anybody who's familiar with the Bible would be aware of the verses in the New Testament that are commonly referred to as the one another passages. So there are probably, I counted at least 24, but there are probably even more than that. Verses where activity is directed at at one another, at people, one person with another person. That's kind of how I've always interpreted it, that I never really saw those verses as for church. Church is some place where you sit down and you look forward and you listen to whoever's up there. So therefore, if you were going to do something with one another, it would be something where you were meeting at coffee, or maybe you met at somebody's house, or maybe you went to go do something fun. That is when you would practice these one another passages. But if you reread the New Testament, especially Paul's epistles, with the lens that the church met in small house churches, and that a lot of these letters to the churches, he was talking to them about how they should act and how they should do their services. How should people do their services? If you look at it from that lens, you'll actually see that those one another verses are actually talking about when you're meeting at the church or at a person's house, then you are not seated such that you're all looking up at one person, but you are seated around the house in whatever chairs are there. Maybe you're sitting on the floor, and you are looking at each other. You are talking to each other. You are participants in the house church. And that is where you exercise these one another passages. Not saying that you couldn't do it outside of those assemblies, of course. You know, they would do things that there is mention of them singing hymns and praying, and of course those activities would be directed towards God. But even those activities, praying and singing, have also a communal benefit, i.e. you hear what somebody's praying about, you hear what's on their heart. Now here's another thing. 1 Corinthians, the whole book, contains the most instructions to Christian assemblies and to just the Christian life style in general in the New Testament by far, hands down. But what I see is that in modern churches, evangelical churches, we tend to stay away from them because of the use of tongues and other spiritual gifts. Even those who believe in speaking in tongues and that the spiritual gifts are for modern times, they tend to focus on individual verses in the book of Corinthians to say, here's how you do it, or really more like, they did it back then, so that's why we're doing it now. There's nothing special about now. But for those who don't believe that the spiritual gifts are for modern times, we shouldn't avoid these verses, because it's inside of these verses that Paul talks about how we are to act and assemble with other believers. And he's not actually instructing them how to pray in tongues. There's not a passage that says, okay, first you clear your mind and you meditate and you ask the Spirit, please say something through me, or something. It's not instructions on how to speak in tongues or how to prophesy. It's how You shouldn't all speak in tongues at the same time. You shouldn't prophesy all at the same time, that you should have an orderly worship. So all those verses in 1 Corinthians are talking about how to hold an assembly. A really good example of this, and a very important verse, I believe, is 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 26. It says, "What then shall we say, brothers and sisters? When you come together, each of you has a hymn, or a word of instruction, or a revelation, or a tongue, or an interpretation. Everything must be done so that the church may be built up." So you might say, oh, wow, he's talking about tongues. I don't believe in tongues. He's talking about interpretation of tongues. So I don't believe in tongues. So I don't believe in interpretation of tongues. So I'm just going to go past this verse. But look at what it says. When you come together, each of you has a hymn, a word of instruction, or a revelation. Those things are still present, even for those who don't believe that the spiritual gifts, the miraculous gifts, are still here for today. And then this idea that everything must be done so that the church, those people who are sitting around this house, may be built up. He's talking about how the purpose of these assemblies the primary purpose of these assemblies is to build one another up. You can really see the stark contrast between these verses and what is done in typical church services today. Typically, there's a few number of people who come who are going to be giving in the service. They're going to be reading something. They're going to be giving some sort of interpretation of a passage, or they're going to preach, or they're going to sing a song, lead a song. And that's a few number of people. And then everybody else is out in the congregation, and they're there to receive. They're there to be, they'll sing themselves, but they are being led in song. They will listen to the preaching. They will be inspired by the preaching. They will be inspired by whatever the teaching is that goes on. That's how the typical service goes. But here, this verse says that everyone has something to give and should give, whatever that is. And everyone is to build everybody else up. In modern churches, not only are there few that give and many that receive, but if you look from week to week, you'll see that the few that give are the same people. There's a small number of people. They may not give every Sunday. They may not give a lesson every Sunday or do a communion lesson every Sunday. Nevertheless, it's a small percentage, a small group of the church that is doing things within the service. Everybody else is there to receive those things. That has a problem because it causes people to not mature spiritually. And certainly it causes people who are just receiving to not mature. But even those who are giving, it causes them to not mature because they become professional givers and they are not working on their own personal relationship with God. They are not being built up by what everybody else is saying in the congregation. They learn how to give. And of course, those who are sitting in the pews, they never have to prepare lessons. They never have to lead a song. They never have to do any of those things. So they are stunted for sure in their maturity. And by maturity, I'm talking about a person's own relationship with God through the Spirit. That is the core of a disciple. And those who give always and those who receive always, they end up, ironically, never connecting with God, but with people. Now, again, I was talking about rereading the New Testament, especially the Paul's epistles. Other passages which don't seem to be directed to house churches, but only because every time we hear the word church or gathering or something like that, we immediately think of the type of typical church that we attend, where we are sitting in the pews or up front saying something. If you reread those with the lens that this is written to small house churches meeting throughout the city or throughout a given city, then if you look at passages like 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1, those two chapters describe in detail the characteristic of elders. Now, through the lens of a large church, the typical lens, This defines a unique, important role that is primarily exercised outside of the church in terms of like pastoring, but that is a special role that only a few people will ever have. And in fact, you may never even find people unless your congregation is large enough. But if you look at this through the lens of small churches, then what Paul is simply doing is describing the ideal leaders for a house church. They're married, which to somebody back then would be like, you don't even need to say that because single people do not own houses. They may now in modern times, even that is far more limited than married couples. But clearly you had to be married back then to have a house. You have to be stable in your relationship with God. You have to be good examples to the rest of the house church that's there. If you have a family, you most likely will have a family because you're old enough again to be married and have the wealth to own a house. And so most likely you have kids. It wasn't a thing back then to choose to not have kids. In fact, it was a terrible burden if you couldn't have or didn't have kids. So everybody had kids from a young age. So those children should be well behaved and they should believe in God and they should believe in Jesus because you're a good example to them. And of course, you need to be able to teach because you should not be doing all of the teaching, but when you do, when it is your turn, most likely you will encourage these people who meet in your house with some sort of knowledge from the Bible, or from, back then it would have been from the apostles, since the Bible hadn't been written down yet, depending on what time we're talking about. And then it says that they can't be new converts or they might become conceited. And I believe that's because it's also one of those things that probably doesn't need to be stated, because if they are new, they won't be able to teach. You wouldn't expect their family to be mature Christians or believers. Let's say somebody who was older, who has a house, happened to become a Christian, and so now their house is available. Paul is warning them to not meet in their house because then they will gain virtue, or they will feel their goodness or what they have to offer is just their house. Again, the idea is that everybody needs to have their own relationship with God. And if someone is young and doesn't understand their own relationship with God, how are they supposed to share that with others that are meeting in their house? How are they supposed to lead others? And the same thing can be said about other types of roles that are mentioned throughout the New Testament. Deacons, again, we look at that as, or typical churches look at that as special people who are particularly good at serving or serve a lot or something like that. That's what the word means. Diakonos means to serve. But in terms of the role, it's just people who serve the disciples at house church assemblies and perhaps throughout the week. Like in Acts chapter 6, you see that there were people who were dedicated to gathering food and delivering it to widows. And then an evangelist who typically leads the church, or a pastor who typically leads the church, what their role really was, again, you have to reread this with the lens of a house church, but what their role was to preach the word outside of the house churches, to call new people to come into the house churches. So their role was outside of the church. They were particularly good at going to the temple courts like Paul, or going around and talking to people. Again, I'm not saying that it's not everybody's responsibility to evangelize, but the person who's called the evangelist back then was not the leader of the church. They were the person who was the best at going out and calling others to follow Christ and starting churches in the first place as well. Same thing with teachers. Teachers really were people who went from house church to house church, teaching deeper knowledge, deeper things about the gospel to these house churches. There are some writings of that in the Didache and some of the early first century and second century ante-Nicene writings. Okay, so that's all interesting stuff about how when you read the New Testament in the Bible, you will see direct mentions and indirect mentions to not just house churches, but what they did and their roles and what they did in the services. Now, in terms of pros and cons, okay, so here are just some things that are pros and cons of the house church itself, not compared to large assembly churches, but just thinking about the house church itself. If you think about finances and money, the pro is that you don't need any. You're meeting in somebody's houses, and so it's a very ultra low overhead. And then whatever funds that are raised go to charity and to missions. And that is what you see with the original collections that were done in the book of Corinthians. You see that Paul is asking those churches who are poor themselves to gather funds to help those people in Jerusalem who were suffering because of a famine. Now, as a con, it's more difficult. You have a limited capacity for projects. Now, you can see how Paul organized those house churches in the city of Corinth and Macedonia, and he came by once a week. They would make a collection, and then he would come by once a week and take that collection and bring it to Jerusalem. So it's not that you can't have large projects or that you can't send a lot to charity, but it does take a little bit more organization. Now, in terms of leadership, the pro is that it's a shared leadership, so everybody's involved, and it's decentralized. So you don't have a single church leader and a bunch of other people who are just members of the church. Now, a con for that would be that most likely that person won't have any theological training, and they may not have any leadership skills, or maybe they don't have excellent leadership skills. Those seem to be pretty rare in terms of people, and so it may be difficult, like I was saying, to find elders, for instance, who could lead. You could meet at their houses, and they could lead these house church services. But this would only be for a certain amount of time, because as you continue to meet in this small house church setting with everybody sharing something, other people will gain leadership skills, and other people will gain, I guess you wouldn't call it formal theological teachings, but people will be more in understanding of what the Bible says, more well-read with the Bible. So teaching a doctrine is similar to leadership, but in the pro for this is that everything is Bible-focused and everything is relational. So it's not that everybody is there to receive and one person is there to give. It's everybody giving to each other. And again, you probably won't have people you might be lucky if you have somebody who has theological PhD in theology and is able to do deep lessons or something, but you wouldn't want that person going on for too long anyway. I'm not a theologian in terms of having a PhD, but you wouldn't want me dominating the conversation. Let's see, mission and outreach. The pro is that you have a very grassroots and organic outreach. You're reaching out to the people of the community, to the people of your neighborhood. But the con would be that it's just limited to the community. It would be very difficult to have a large scale, outside of your country type of an outreach. Not that it's impossible, but it would take the organization of multiple house churches in order to do that. Now, in terms of discipleship, the pro is that you have close accountability. You have these people that are meeting at this house once a week at least, and they are sharing from their own lives. And so you have personal accountability. You have these people growing spiritually because even the young disciples are learning how to share. And you have reliance on the Spirit because not only during the services, but outside of the services, you now have your own independent relationship with God that you have to rely on, the Spirit. And con is that it's hard to have specialized ministries. I spoke about this last week, that it would be difficult for a house church to have child care that's teaching the kids about the Bible, for instance, or it'd be difficult to have a married ministry and things like that. As far as community goes, you have strong personalized relationships and the ability to help individuals. So if that's what you see in like Acts chapter 6, is that they were collecting food for those people who had need in the community, and those are the people who were going to these house churches. So if you're meeting with a bunch of people in your house and one of them has some sort of a need, then everybody just gives to them. Maybe it's money, maybe they get groceries or whatever, but it's a very personalized relationship. A con with you could see with house churches, it would be difficult to resolve conflict. It'd be difficult to deal with differences in people's beliefs. That is one thing that if somebody's going to a particular large congregation church, they are going there because of whatever their name is and whatever their doctrine is that might be on their website and so forth. Okay, so let me just finish by talking about what is the future for house churches. First of all, we saw that there already is a presence of house churches in communities, but it's difficult to find them because I didn't even know about them until I searched for them, researched them today. But for me, the future is house churches. I've just seen too many problems that are direct results of large churches. Too many hurts, too many abuses, too many people who have left, too many people who are dependent on the church for their relationship with God, many not even knowing what an independent relationship with God is. There's just been too many of the cons, if you will, of large churches. They seem to be difficult, if not impossible, to overcome. And there seems to be a tendency for these types of behaviors to develop. For instance, a small group of people who are leading the services from week to week, and other people not growing and hiding in the pews, as it were. I also realize that it's highly unlikely that any existing large church or organization of churches would simply say, this is the right way to go, we're going to convert to house churches. It's just too steep a hill to climb. You think about evangelists and other paid staff, what are they going to do? What about all the buildings that they have? How would they control these house churches? How would they pick house church leaders and so forth? I just don't see that happening. But I can envision the problems with house churches as well. Once people have or want to start house churches, questions like, what doctrine are you going to teach? What beliefs must people have in common who are going there? How do people transition from being a pew-sitting receiver type of Christian to a participating, caring, giving person? That might be difficult, but I would say it's essential, or a requirement really for someone's relationship with God. And then once you do get a house full of people, what do you do to praise God? What activities do you do? Do you sing a cappella songs? You're definitely not going to have a band. Have like 20 people in a house. 6 of them are in the band. I mean, imagine how sometimes those are loud in churches. Imagine how loud it would be in your house and what your neighbors would think. So I have a lot more to say about Christian house churches. But this is the end of this series, the end of part 8, 8-part series. And what is the next series is going to be on, which will tie into this. The title of the series will be How to Worship God. I don't know if there'll be 8 parts or not, but that's what the next series will be on. I hope you'll join me for that. Remember to like and subscribe and to share this with your friends, and have a great evening.